"You're a burden, Dad." The words didn't just come out. They hit the air like a sharp slap. It wasn't just a statement. It was an execution of dignity in broad daylight. Calvin, a young man in his late 20s with ambition that outran his gratitude, stood in the center of the living room. His voice was rough, full of frustration that had long since curdled into arrogance. Across from him, Jeremiah, his 70-year-old father, stood tall despite the weight of age and disappointment. His back was slightly bent from years of hard labor, his long grey beard glinting under the low evening light. His hands were steady, the hands of a man who'd built a life from the ground up, now treated as if that life had no worth. The house was small, but warm, the kind of place that used to smell of cornbread, gospel music and laughter. Tonight it smelled like tension and pride. The late sun crawled through the blinds, cutting stripes of golden light across the floorboards, landing on Jeremiah's shoes, old, polished, still respected. He had worn them to church, to his wife's funeral, and to every family gathering where his son once smiled beside him. But that boy was gone. Calvin's voice rose, sharp as a blade. "Do you even realize how useless you've become? You sit here every day doing nothing but looking out that window like the world owes you something. You're living under my roof, eating my food, and you've got the nerve to act like you still matter." Jeremiah said nothing. His calm was eerie, like still water hiding deep currents beneath. He stood by the edge of the window, looking out at the street he once walked proudly, the same street where he had carried Calvin on his shoulders as a boy. He could still hear his laughter echoing faintly, a ghost of joy from another lifetime. He turned his eyes back to his son, not to argue, not to defend himself, but to see him, really see what time and pride had turned him into. "Why won't you say anything?" Calvin snapped, stepping closer. "You're just gonna stand there? That's what you always do, silent, useless. You can't even fight back." Jeremiah finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Fighting back doesn't build anything, son. It only burns what's left." But Calvin didn't hear him, or maybe he refused to. "You talk like you know something about life," he said bitterly. "You don't. You wasted yours. You had nothing when I was a kid, and you still have nothing now. I'm not going to live like that. I'm done pretending you're some wise man just because you're old." Jeremiah took one step toward him, slow, deliberate. His presence alone quieted the air for a moment. He reached for his old walking cane leaning against the chair. The sound of its wooden tip tapping against the floor was steady, like a heartbeat. "I'm proud of you for building something, Calvin," he said softly. "But don't mistake your roof for a crown. This house may be yours, but it's built on my back. Every brick, every nail. Remember that." Calvin's expression twisted. Pride and shame battled across his face, but pride won. "I don't care what you built. I'm not going to live with a man who refuses to move forward. You should have gone to a home years ago. You're just—" He paused, letting the venom drip. "A burden." The words hung there. Final. Jeremiah looked at him for a long time. Then slowly he nodded, not in agreement but in acceptance of what had become inevitable. "All right," he said, barely above a whisper. He reached for his old hat, brushed it off gently and placed it on his head. He zipped up his worn leather coat and picked up a folded piece of paper from the coffee table. As he turned toward the door, the evening breeze pushed lightly through the open window, rustling the paper in his hand. Calvin crossed his arms, glaring. "Good, finally. Maybe now I can have peace in my own house." Jeremiah's steps were slow but certain. He reached the front door, turned the knob, and paused just long enough for the air to thicken again. He looked back once, as not at his son, but at the home itself, at the memories that clung to the walls. Then he stepped out. The porch light flickered as the door shut behind him. The night had grown cold, clouds gathering above like silent witnesses. Jeremiah walked down the cracked concrete path and stopped at the gate. He unfolded the paper and wrote something on it. 3 short lines, each one deliberate, like a message meant for time itself. He pinned it to the gate with a small nail, his movements slow and careful. When he was done, he stood there for a moment, the street lamp casting a golden halo over his grey beard. His eyes were calm, but there was something buried behind them. Not anger, not sorrow, but certainty. Then, without looking back, he walked down the street and disappeared into the night. Inside the house, Calvin sat on the couch staring at the door, trying to feel triumphant. But the silence that filled the house was heavier than victory. The echo of his father's cane tapping away down the street stayed with him long after he was gone. The note fluttered lightly in the night breeze, waiting for morning. The morning came slow, grey and heavy, the kind of morning that carried silence like a burden. The light broke through the blinds of the living room, falling across Calvin's face as he lay asleep on the couch, still wearing last night's clothes. Empty bottles of cheap beer stood on the table, silent witnesses to a restless night. His dreams had been haunted. Images of his father walking down that dark street, the sound of his cane echoing like a slow, steady heartbeat fading into the distance. A knock at the door pulled him from his uneasy sleep. He sat up, groggy, rubbing his eyes. "Who the hell's knocking this early?" he muttered. The knocking continued, steady, patient, almost polite. He opened the door to find Mr. Turner, their elderly neighbor, standing outside in a brown cardigan and slippers, his face tight with concern. "Morning, Calvin," Turner said, shifting uneasily. "You might want to come see this. It's about your daddy." Calvin frowned, the words slicing through his haze. "What about him?" Turner pointed toward the front gate. "He left a note out there last night." "It's strange. Been flapping in the wind all morning." Calvin sighed, running a hand through his messy curls. "Old man probably wrote one of his dramatic speeches again. He loves his words." But when he stepped out and walked toward the gate, something about the morning air felt different, thicker, heavier. The sound of the wind was sharp, carrying the distant hum of the city. Birds perched on the power line, quiet, watching. There it was, the note. A small folded piece of paper, nailed right into the wood. The handwriting was neat, firm, unmistakably Jeremiah's. The ink had bled slightly from the morning dew. Calvin hesitated before pulling it loose, the nail squealing faintly against the board. He unfolded it slowly. 3 short lines stared back at him, written in calm, deliberate strokes. "A man who forgets his roots will one day lose his roof. What's taken for granted always takes back. Watch what you've built when silence begins to speak." Calvin frowned, scoffing under his breath. "What the hell does that even mean?" Turner stood behind him, squinting. "Sounds like your daddy always did. Poetic, but heavy." "You sure you're all right, son?" "I'm fine," Calvin said sharply, crumpling the paper. "Old man's trying to guilt-trip me even now." But his voice lacked conviction. He shoved the note in his pocket and turned to go back inside. The rest of the day moved oddly slow. Every time Calvin tried to focus on work calls, his mind wandered back to that message. The phrasing played in his head like an echo. "Lose his roof." Silence begins to speak. It felt like a warning, but he dismissed it, forcing himself to believe it was just his father's dramatic nonsense. Around noon, the house phone rang. He picked up absent-mindedly, expecting a client. "Mr. Harris?" a calm woman's voice asked. "This is Denise from the county records office. So I'm calling to confirm that your father's name has officially been removed from the property deed, per his request, yesterday evening." Calvin froze. "Wait, what?" "Yes," she continued politely. "Mr. Jeremiah Harris signed the release last night and transferred the title. The ownership is now pending reassignment based on his—" Calvin cut her off. "He what? He doesn't even own this house anymore. I bought it last year." There was a brief pause. "That's not what our records show, sir." The house title was still jointly listed. "His portion has now been legally reassigned. You'll be receiving notice within 48 hours regarding the change." The line went dead before Calvin could respond. He dropped the phone, his chest tightening. He hadn't even known his father still had legal rights to the house. He had assumed arrogantly that everything under that roof was his, bought with his paycheck, his name, his effort. Now doubt seeped in like water under a door. What did his father mean by, "What's taken for granted always takes back"? The afternoon sun burned hot, and the silence in the house deepened. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and Calvin found himself pacing the floor, glancing toward the front gate every few minutes. The note, its words, it wouldn't leave his mind. Around 3, his phone buzzed again. This time it was Lisa, his father's old attorney. "Calvin, I just wanted to inform you. Your father left me instructions to activate a legal motion if certain words were said to him by family members." He swallowed. "What kind of motion?" There was a pause. "It's unusual but valid. He transferred financial control of certain assets and investments, that you might have been indirectly benefiting from. He wanted to ensure that no one who called him a burden ever profited from his work. Calvin's voice cracked. "You're joking." "I'm not," Lisa replied gently. "Your father was meticulous. He even recorded the incident outside the house last night. Everything is time-stamped." "I'm sorry, Calvin." But he meant what he wrote. Calvin sank into the couch, his hands gripping his head. His world, his confidence, his arrogance began to crumble like wet paper. Outside, the note on the gate still fluttered softly in the afternoon breeze. Across town, Jeremiah sat in a small diner, sipping coffee in silence. The radio played faint jazz in the background. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply looked out the window, eyes heavy but calm, as if time itself had finally slowed down to listen to him. For the first time in years, he felt no weight pressing on his chest, no tension, no argument waiting to happen. Just peace. And back at the house, his son's peace was beginning to rot from within. The note, though removed, had already begun its quiet destruction. That evening, the house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a stranger's space, quiet, cold, and accusing. Calvin sat at the dining table, his laptop open, eyes glazed over the same spreadsheet he'd been staring at for hours. His phone sat face down beside a half-empty glass of whiskey. He hadn't eaten all day. Every sound in the house, the ticking clock, the hum of the AC, pressed down on him, drilling the same thought into his skull. The old man set me up. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled note and smoothed it across the table. The words looked different now, heavier, like they were written in ink made of regret. "A man who forgets his roots will one day lose his roof. What's taken for granted always takes back. Watch what you've built when silence begins to speak." He whispered the lines under his breath as if hoping they'd change, but they didn't. "Lose his roof," he muttered. "What the hell did you do, old man?" The phone rang again. This time it wasn't the attorney or the records office. It was Elaine, his father's old friend from the church choir. She'd known Jeremiah since the days when he worked at the shipyard. "Calvin, honey," she said gently, her voice carrying that soft southern lilt. "I don't mean to disturb you, but your father called me earlier this morning. Asked me to tell you something if you tried to reach him." Calvin's chest tightened. "What did he say?" Elaine hesitated. "He said, 'Tell my son I left him exactly what he gave me.'" Silence. The line stayed quiet for several seconds. Calvin forced a weak laugh. That's just like him, dramatic as ever. But deep down, something inside him trembled. He stood pacing the floor, looking around the house. His expensive furniture, the flat-screen TV, the framed degree on the wall, all of it felt hollow now. None of it meant anything if the man who helped him build his foundation had just stripped it away. Then came the sound, a faint ping from his laptop. An email notification. He clicked it open and froze. Subject: Notice of Account Transfer. From Jeremiah Harris Foundation, Trust Administrator. The message was short, direct and final. Per Mr. Jeremiah Harris's directive, your access to all joint and dependent accounts has been revoked. Remaining funds have been relocated to charitable foundations in his name. For questions, please contact our legal department. Calvin's eyes widened as his cursor hovered over his banking tab. He logged in, his balance 34,72 as he blinked. Refreshed, same. His chest began to tighten. No. He opened another account, the one tied to his business, only to find it frozen. The financial rug had been pulled right out from under him. Every cent that had once made him feel powerful, secure, untouchable, gone. He slammed his fist against the table so hard that the glass toppled over, shattering across the floor. The sound echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls like a cruel laugh. He stormed to the front door and yanked it open, staring out at the empty street. The gate still bore a faint imprint from where the note had been nailed. He whispered through clenched teeth, "You think you won, old man? You think this makes you righteous?" The street didn't answer. Only the wind did, a dry whisper that rustled the leaves and carried away what little pride he had left. Hours passed. The daylight faded into dusk. The silence grew heavier. By nightfall, Calvin's phone began lighting up with messages from business partners, clients, and even friends. Each one sounded the same. "We're sorry, but we can't proceed until the situation is cleared." The note's curse was unfolding piece by piece. At 9:42 p.m., the final blow came, a call from the bank manager. "Mr. Harris," the man said professionally, "due to irregularities in the trust documents and the removal of your name from several linked accounts, your pending mortgage has been voided. We'll be issuing a property reassessment by morning." Calvin leaned back, gripping his forehead. You mean I could lose the house?" "Yes, sir. Unless you can prove ownership and solvency, repossession is possible within 10 days. He didn't even have words. Just a hollow laugh that turned into a slow, trembling breath. He sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the floor. Then his eyes drifted toward the small wooden box on the mantel, the one his father had given him years ago, back when they still spoke without shouting. He walked over, opened it slowly. Inside was an old photograph. Jeremiah in his work overalls standing beside a much younger Calvin, both smiling in front of a half-built house. "We built this together, son," his father had said that day. "A house ain't just walls. It's respect, care, and gratitude holding it up." Calvin's throat tightened. He placed the photo down, wiping a tear before it fell. Then he noticed something tucked beneath the frame, a folded receipt, yellowed with age. It was from the lumber yard, dated 32 years ago. The name at the bottom, Jeremiah Harris, paid in full. Calvin stood there frozen, realizing something that hit him harder than any insult ever could. His father had literally built the foundation he was standing on. The roof. The walls, the floors, that they weren't his. They never were. When Jeremiah had said, "What's taken for granted always takes back," he wasn't speaking in riddles. He was speaking truth, and that truth had now come to collect. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. The storm gathered as if the sky itself mourned for what had been lost between father and son. Calvin stood at the window, watching the streetlight flicker through the downpour, and whispered, "I messed up, Pop. I really did." But Jeremiah wasn't there to hear it. Not yet. The silence was his answer, the same silence that had once protected him, now teaching him the lesson he never wanted to learn, that the weight of disrespect is the heaviest burden of all. And that night, as thunder rolled over the city, Calvin finally began to understand the true meaning of his father's note. The morning came heavy, dragging itself through the gray clouds that loomed over the neighborhood. The storm from the night before had left puddles across the driveway, and the house that once gleamed like success now looked like an abandoned memory. Calvin hadn't slept. His eyes were swollen, his shirt still damp with the rain he'd stood in until midnight. His phone vibrated again. Unknown number. He hesitated but answered. "Mr. Harris?" came a deep voice. "This is Detective Reeves, City Precinct. Are you aware that your father, Mr. Jeremiah Harris, signed a property transfer notice for this residence 6 months ago?" Calvin's grip tightened on the phone. "Transfer notice? What are you talking about?" The detective's tone was firm but polite. "The house was placed under the Jeremiah Harris Community Trust. His name is the principal trustee. You're listed as a temporary resident, not the owner. If you've been receiving eviction or repossession threats, I suggest you reach out to the trust's legal counsel." Calvin's mouth went dry. "Wait, are you saying this house isn't mine?" "I'm saying it never was," Reeves replied. "Your father might have allowed you to stay here, but he never transferred ownership. He protected it. Smart man, if you ask me." Click. The call ended. For a long moment, Calvin just stood there, the weight of it all pressing into his chest. The house, the accounts, the nameplate on the gate that read Harris Residence. It all belonged to a man he'd just called a burden. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, muttering, "Old man." "What did you do?" He grabbed his coat and keys, slamming the door behind him. The street was wet, the air heavy with the scent of earth and rain. He climbed into his car and sped off, heading toward the one place he thought Jeremiah might be, the church where his father volunteered every Sunday morning. The old church sat on the corner of Maple and 9th, its bricks darkened by time, its steeple cutting through the clouds. Calvin pushed open the doors and walked in. The faint sound of a choir rehearsal echoed through the sanctuary, but Jeremiah was nowhere in sight. "Excuse me," he said to the woman at the piano. "I'm looking for Mr. Harris, Jeremiah Harris." She looked up, surprised. "Oh, Pastor Harris? He's not here, son. He left early this morning for a community meeting over at the youth center." "Pastor?" Calvin echoed, blinking. "He's a pastor now?" The woman smiled softly. Been one for 3 years now. Helps young men find work. Mentors the ones without fathers. Good man, your daddy. Calvin felt a lump in his throat. His father, the man he'd accused of being a burden, was out there feeding kids and building lives while his own son drowned in selfish regret. He turned, walking out of the church into the sharp morning air. The clouds were breaking now, light slicing through the grey. The drive to the youth centre felt endless, every red light mocking him with silence. When he arrived, the lot was full. Through the window he could see his father, tall, dignified, his long grey beard catching the sunlight as he spoke to a group of young men in work uniforms. There was something magnetic about Jeremiah, that calm authority, that steady presence. Even from a distance he looked like strength itself. Calvin parked, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he was going to say. What could he say? Sorry? That felt too small, too late. He waited until Jeremiah finished his talk. The young men shook his hand one by one and left. Jeremiah turned to leave and froze when he saw his son. The two men stood there for a long moment, the years of distance between them heavy as the silence itself. Finally, Jeremiah spoke, voice calm but firm. You found your way here. That's a start. Calvin swallowed hard. Dad, Jeremiah raised a hand. Don't start with excuses, son. You had plenty of words that night. Let me have mine now. Calvin nodded, eyes down. Jeremiah stepped closer, his eyes full of tired disappointment, not anger. You called me a burden, Calvin. The same man who carried you on his shoulders when your mother passed. The same man who gave up his pension to put you through business school. Tell me, son, when did I become your shame? Calvin's lip quivered. I don't know. I got lost. I wanted to be more than what we came from. Jeremiah sighed, his deep voice echoing through the hallway. There's nothing wrong with wanting more, but not when it costs you your soul. You see, son, money and pride make a man forget who he is, until both are gone. Tears welled up in Calvin's eyes. Dad, I didn't mean it. I was angry, stupid. I thought... You thought you were above me, Jeremiah interrupted gently. But life has a way of balancing pride. The note wasn't to destroy you, son. It was to show you what it feels like to stand where I stood, invisible. Calvin's voice cracked. You took everything from me. No, Jeremiah said softly. I gave everything back to where it belonged. The house, the money, they were never meant to cage your heart. They were meant to remind you of work, respect, and gratitude. You threw me out that night, and I didn't fight back because I knew the world would teach you what I couldn't. He paused, then added quietly, and it did. Calvin broke down, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Dad, I really am. Jeremiah stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. Son, forgiveness is easy. But respect, that must be earned again. Calvin nodded through tears. I'll do whatever it takes. Jeremiah looked into his eyes the way only a father could, seeing both the boy and the broken man inside. Then start by learning to stand again. Come by the center tomorrow. We're building housing for homeless veterans. You'll help with the work. Sweat teaches humility better than sermons. Calvin nodded slowly, his voice trembling. I'll be here. I promise. Jeremiah smiled faintly, turning to leave. Good. Maybe by the time the roof's done, you'll understand what it means to have one. Calvin stood there, tears blurring his vision, watching his father walk away, his long grey beard swaying gently in the morning breeze. The man he'd called a burden now looked like a king, and for the first time in years Calvin didn't feel angry. He felt small and grateful. He looked back at the youth centre, the place where his father spent his days helping others rebuild what life had broken. For the first time, Calvin wanted to rebuild too. He whispered, almost to himself, tomorrow, Pop, I'll be here, but deep down, he already knew some debts can't be repaid with money and only with redemption. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the cracked sidewalks of East Brookfield. The air was damp, still smelling of the rain that had washed away last night's dust, like the world itself was trying to start over. Calvin stood outside the youth centre at 7 a.m., his hands shoved into his coat pockets, his pride still stinging from everything he'd learned the day before. He hadn't slept much. His mind kept replaying every word his father had said, every quiet sentence that cut deeper than any insult he'd ever heard. Forgiveness is easy, but respect, that must be earned again. Inside the center, the sound of men working echoed through the old building. Hammers struck nails, Wood creaked and sawdust floated through streaks of morning light. Jeremiah stood in the middle of it all, calm and composed, giving quiet instructions to a few volunteers. He didn't see Calvin at first. He was too focused, too steady, like a man who'd long since made peace with life's noise. Calvin hesitated before stepping forward. "Morning, Pop." Jeremiah turned, his sharp brown eyes scanning his son for a long moment before nodding slightly. "You're early." "I wanted to be," Calvin said quietly. Jeremiah motioned to a pile of lumber stacked near the wall. "Good. Then start there. The veterans' dorms need new frames. The faster we build, the sooner a few good men get off the streets." Calvin nodded, took off his coat and began to work. At first, the weight of the hammer felt foreign to his hands. His palms, used to office keyboards and soft leather steering wheels, blistered within the hour. Sweat trickled down his back. He wanted to stop, to rest. But every time he glanced at his father, he saw that same stillness, that same strength that had always seemed effortless. The older men around him noticed. "You the pastor's boy?" one of them asked with a faint grin. Calvin smiled awkwardly. "Used to be," the man chuckled. "Ain't no used to be when it comes to blood." "You're his boy till the grave. Better swing that hammer like he taught you." By noon, Calvin's arms ached, and his shirt clung to his skin. Jeremiah called for a break. The volunteers gathered under the shade of an old oak, drinking water and laughing about stories from the past. Jeremiah sat on the steps, quietly flipping through some papers. Calvin approached him, hesitant but sincere. "Pop, I didn't know you did all this." "The center, the veterans' homes. I thought you retired after Mom died." Jeremiah looked up, his long gray beard catching the sun. "Son, retirement doesn't mean sitting in silence. It means using time wisely. After your mother passed, I learned that grief can either bury you or build you. I chose to build." Calvin nodded, staring at his calloused hands. "I should have been here." "I should have known," Jeremiah's eyes softened. "You had your life to live. But pride blinded you. You thought the world owed you more than it owed anyone else." "I did," Calvin admitted, his voice cracking. "And I lost everything because of it. The house, the company, the woman I loved, all gone." Jeremiah leaned back, silent for a moment. "Good," he said finally. Calvin blinked. "Good," Jeremiah nodded. "Because when a man loses everything, he can finally see what matters. You can rebuild money, but rebuilding character, that takes humility. You can't buy it, son. You have to earn it one day at a time." Calvin looked down, his eyes glistening. "Then let me start today." Jeremiah smiled faintly. "Then get back to work." Hours passed. The rhythm of hammering and cutting filled the air again. Sweat dripped from Calvin's face, mixing with the dirt on his hands. But for the first time, the exhaustion felt good, cleansing even. Every swing of the hammer seemed to chip away at the arrogance that had once consumed him. By evening, the sun had turned the sky into a watercolor of gold and crimson. The team gathered for one last task, lifting the wooden crossbeam that would crown the new dormitory. It took 6 men to hoist it up. Jeremiah stood on one side, Calvin on the other. Their eyes met across the beam, a silent acknowledgement that something between them had begun to heal. When the beam locked into place, Jeremiah spoke quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Strong foundations hold even in storms." Calvin nodded, breathing heavily. "You mean buildings or people?" Jeremiah smiled. "Both." As they packed up tools and washed their hands, a woman approached the site, a city representative. She greeted Jeremiah warmly. "Pastor Harris, the mayor wants to see you next week. The city council approved funding for 3 more community homes under your trust. Congratulations." Jeremiah nodded with a modest smile. "That's good news." "Thank you." The woman turned to Calvin. "You must be his son. You've got your father's eyes." Calvin chuckled softly. "And finally trying to have his heart." She smiled and left. Jeremiah stood there quietly for a moment, watching the horizon. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Doing something real with your hands again." Calvin nodded. "It feels honest." Jeremiah's expression softened. "Honesty is where every man must start, no matter how far he's fallen." The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, the kind that fills a gap instead of deepening it. As the sky darkened, Calvin turned toward his father. "Pop, I want to ask something." "That note I found, the one I said destroyed my life. Why did you write it?" Jeremiah exhaled slowly. "Because you needed to see that peace doesn't come from control, son. It comes from release. That note was a release. From years of being disrespected, dismissed, ignored. I didn't write it to destroy your life. I wrote it to free both of us. Calvin's eyes glistened. And you did. Jeremiah looked at him, a small, proud smile tugging at his lips. No, son, you did. The moment you showed up here. Calvin turned to the half-built dorm behind them, the sound of laughter echoing from the men cleaning up. Maybe this is what I was missing all along. Jeremiah placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Then hold on to it, because the world will always try to make you forget. For a long time, they just stood there, father and son, in the golden hush of a setting sun, surrounded by the echoes of hammer strikes and the quiet redemption of work. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew this moment of shared silence was worth more than any apology or fortune could ever be. The following week unfolded slowly, quieter than Calvin was used to, but also strangely grounding. Every morning he arrived at the youth center before sunrise, before even the lights came on. He swept the floors, organized supplies, carried lumber. He didn't have to be told what to do anymore. The rhythm of service had settled into his bones, replacing the restless ambition that had once kept him awake at night. And every morning, he'd see his father sitting in the corner of the half-built dormitory, coffee in hand, reading a worn Bible whose pages had yellowed from years of use. Jeremiah Harris didn't say much. He didn't need to. His silence filled the space like wisdom itself, calm, steady, untouchable. Calvin sometimes wondered if his father even knew how much those moments meant. Watching him, hearing the sound of pages turning, the soft rumble of his low voice greeting each worker by name, it reminded Calvin of the man he'd once refused to see. The man beneath the beard and the wrinkles, a man carved from patience and pain. On Thursday afternoon, the mayor arrived. The city was honoring Jeremiah for his work with the Harris Community Trust. Cameras clicked. Local news reporters swarmed. Jeremiah, dressed in his old brown suit, stood like a mountain among them, tall, composed, and quietly radiant. Calvin stood off to the side, hammer in hand, watching. For the first time in years, pride didn't feel heavy. It felt pure. The mayor shook Jeremiah's hand. Pastor Harris, your dedication has restored hope to this part of the city. You've shown us that humility and service still build stronger foundations than pride and power. Jeremiah smiled modestly. I'm no hero, Mayor. Just a father trying to leave this world better than he found it. There was light applause. But behind the noise, Calvin heard a quiet truth. His father's voice carried weight because it came from silence. After the ceremony, Jeremiah approached him. You've been showing up every day, he said simply. That's good, Calvin nodded. Feels right. I've been thinking a lot, Pop. Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. About what? About how you handled everything. When I yelled at you. When I threw you out. You didn't shout back, you didn't fight. You just walked away and left that note. Jeremiah's eyes softened. Sometimes the greatest lesson a father can give isn't in words. It's in what he refuses to say. When a man loses his peace, shouting only proves he's lost control. Calvin looked down, swallowing hard. You could have destroyed me completely, Pop, but you didn't. Jeremiah smiled faintly. I didn't need to. Life has its own justice. I just stepped aside to let it do its work. They both turned, as a group of young men laughed nearby, stacking bricks for the new wing. For a moment, Jeremiah just watched them, his long grey beard brushing against the wind. You see them? He asked. Half of them grew up without fathers. The world taught them anger early, before they even knew what love was. That's why I stay here, not to preach, just to remind them that strength can be gentle too. Calvin nodded, a slow tear tracing his cheek. You're everything I should have been. Jeremiah shook his head. No, I'm everything you can still be. That night, after everyone had gone home, Calvin stayed behind. He walked through the quiet halls of the youth center, tracing his fingers along the new wooden beams. He remembered the words from that cursed night. You're a burden, Dad. They burned in his chest. He walked outside into the cool evening air. The city was hushed, streetlights flickering softly against the pavement. His father's old truck was parked near the gate. Jeremiah sat inside, head bowed, hands resting on the steering wheel. Calvin approached quietly, unsure if he should disturb him. But Jeremiah opened his eyes before he could speak. Couldn't sleep either. Calvin smiled faintly. Guess it runs in the family. Jeremiah gestured to the passenger seat. Sit. They sat there in silence for a long time, the hum of crickets filling the space between them. Finally, Jeremiah spoke. I'm not angry at you anymore, son. Truth is, I never really was. Disappointed, yes. But anger fades with time. Disrespect only hurts when love still lives underneath it. Calvin turned toward him. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Jeremiah chuckled softly. Forgiveness ain't about what you deserve, Calvin. It's about what the heart can't carry anymore. A long pause followed. Then Jeremiah pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handed it to him. I meant to give you this when the time was right. Calvin opened it. It was a property document, the Harris Trust Agreement, with a signature at the bottom. His father's, and under it a new line in pen. Add Calvin Harris as co-trustee. Calvin looked up, eyes wide. Dad, you're giving this back? Jeremiah nodded. Not giving, sharing, you've learned what pride costs. Now you need to learn what legacy means. The trust belongs to the people, not us. But one day I won't be around. And when that day comes, they'll need someone who knows the cost of silence. Calvin's throat tightened. You think I can handle that? Jeremiah looked at him, his voice low and steady. You already are. Calvin exhaled, the weight of both shame and gratitude washing over him. I'll protect it, Pop, I promise. Jeremiah smiled faintly. Then I can rest easy. They sat in that truck for a while longer, not as father and son, but as two men bound by something deeper. The unspoken truth that redemption doesn't come from words, but from what you build afterward. The next morning, Jeremiah didn't show up at the center. When Calvin called, no answer. He drove to his father's small home near the river. The front door was unlocked. Inside, sunlight poured through the windows, landing on the armchair by the window where Jeremiah sat. Peaceful, eyes closed, Bible open on his lap. A cup of coffee rested beside him, still warm. Calvin froze, staring at his father's calm face. He looked like he was just asleep, like he'd found rest after a lifetime of carrying storms. Tears streamed down Calvin's cheeks as he knelt beside him. Pop, wake up. We still have work to do. But Jeremiah Harris was gone. Gone the way quiet men go, without fanfare. Without noise, just a whisper of peace left behind. Later that day, as people gathered to mourn, Calvin stood before the youth center, the same building they'd built together. The sign above the entrance now read, The Jeremiah Harris Foundation, built on dignity and redemption. He placed his hand on the sign, whispering, You built more than walls, old man. You built me. And as the evening sun broke through the clouds, lighting the city in gold, Calvin smiled faintly, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. His father's silence had taught him what words never could, and in that silence Calvin finally found peace.